Okay, today we are continuing our investigations of stones in the Greco-Roman world, moving into part 2 of today's lecture. Our class objectives for the second half of the class will bring us to a further investigation of arches and an introduction to arcades. For the material study, we're going to think about stones in the making of the political and social order of empire. We're going to look at aqueducts, monumental arches, and the Appian Way. Or Appian, any way you'd like to say it. While we usually start class with the introduction of a particular set of architectural terminology, today that terminology is going to take a slight shift. While we'll look at arches and their physical features, the study of Roman architecture will be our guide not only to the study of stone masonry and architectural innovation, it is the study of just how these engineering feats were used in the service of the expansion of an empire. To be clear, architecture has been in the service of empire from humanity's earliest explorations of power and expansion. From neighboring groups in prehistoric times, utilizing caves, jungles, and other geological structures to conquer one another, to the earliest Egyptian and Latin American empires we've already examined. But as we gain more tools in our architectural analysis, we're going to begin to look at the way that these seemingly inert materials contribute to very active, very energized modes of civilizational construction, civilization's decline, and expansion through empire and colonization. So to that end, we'll be looking at the use of stone for the consolidation of political legacies, as well as entertainment and displays of state power over life and death. We'll also be looking at them through the lens of the expansion of territory, through the control of essential resources like water and waste management. We'll also think about stones as technologies to expedite the delivery of war, enforcement, and other entities of the state throughout its territory. Overall, we are driving to expand from basic formal and material analyses to understand the essential role that architecture plays in the development of politics and culture. To get there, let's begin with arches round 2. Think a minute about what we're looking at. I've provided an image citation at the top. It's Pont Saint Martin or Pont Saint Martin in the Aosta Valley in Italy, and it was constructed around 100 BCE. So that means it's over 2,000 years old, this bridge. The bridge has a 103-foot span, and it's one of the largest surviving bridges from antiquity. Let's take a quick look at what it's doing. As we learned in the earlier section today, bridges are, well, we didn't learn that yet, but as we learned in the earlier section today, arches function through compression. They function through forces that are pressing in on and down on each other. As we can see from this diagram below, the compression forces coming down on the top of the bridge, or the weight or the load pressing down on the top of the bridge that we are demonstrating here is a light load. It's not very heavy. It might be, a couple of horses trotting across the Pont Saint Martin. We know this because of the trajectory of those compression forces. If you see E2 and that squiggly red line that I've got going down, when a load is light on the top of the arch, those compression forces move through the stones of the arch themselves, staying within the boundaries of the arch. Under those conditions, the arch can successfully keep itself together. When the load gets a little bit heavier, let's say it's a few carts with their horses and people and goods attached, at this point the load from above, we'll just say that's a medium load. It becomes a little bit heavier, and if we did a stress diagram on the compression of this bridge, we would see that that arc of compression moves a little bit further out than that first E2 line. It's still within the boundaries of the arch, and the arch still stands. Let's imagine we get a huge army with all of their military paraphernalia, heavy carts and heavy machinery, early machinery, right? At this point, with that heavy load, we are at the point of failure. You can see here in the E3 trajectory of that compression load that the compression forces start to push outside that upper boundary of the arch. And when that happens, the arch is going to collapse. Oddly enough, it's not going to collapse down and inward as we would think it might, but as we saw in some of those earlier as we saw in some of the earlier videos about arches, the stones are going to want to kick up and out from the side. Almost if you imagine this thing kind of blowing its own roof off, up and out. To overcome this, the Romans created what's known as the arc and spandrel system. And that looks like this. It looks exactly like the Pont Saint-Martin that we saw earlier. Now, up above that arch, surrounding it from the top and the two sides, is a heavy mass that exists there to keep the stones from exploding up and out, or from breaking in that sort of upward, outward, explosive fashion, because they're simply just pressing down on it. It's kind of basic gravity, but it was an ingenious invention that allowed much larger bridge spans under much higher compression than had been possible before. Now when we look at Pont Saint-Martin, we see it as the spandrel solution that it is. And it's been working for 2,000 years with cars, trucks, no matter what's driving over the top of it. Because of that extra expanse at the side and on the tops, this bridge has been able to resist collapse. All right, let's look at another system of arches. And don't get too worried about the engineering or physics that's involved here. I just want you to have a general idea of how these compression forces work. I'm not going to ask you to draw those diagram lines to tell me which is which, but you do want to know what happens with failure on an arch. Okay, so now we are at the Pont de Garde in Roman Gaul, which is now France. This was first constructed in 300 CE and widened in the 1700s. What we're seeing here is one of the most famous aqueducts. It represents an expansion of territory through the control of essential resources like water, waste management. Armies could travel over the bridges that are built on top of these. It's really a technological marvel for empire expansion at its time. So it's an arcade. What we're describing here is an arcade. A series of arches, a group of arches all lined up, that's called an arcade. Why aren't these arches collapsing? There's a huge amount of weight. We've got 3 different arcades stacked on top of one another just for that very top level to carry water. What's happening physically is that each arch, let's focus on the red ones, is distributing force down its side, as we saw in that first arch and spandrel diagram. The weight of each arcade above is distributed across the span of the arch, down through the columns at its side. And one would think that it could collapse under the pressure, but by lining one arch up to the next, up to the next, up to the next, equal and opposite reactions are occurring on each neighboring arch, and they cancel out the possibility of collapse from compression. Just think about it a minute. The thing about this is it would have been impossible to consider this kind of span. Imagine if you had a single arch crossing over this riverbed. You would have to have unbelievably massive spandrels to keep that arch stable and to carry the load that would be traveling across it. By creating a multitude of smaller arches, by creating this arcade, the Romans were able to do something that wasn't possible for most engineers and contractors until the invention of steel. Just a little history on the aqueduct. The origin is contested. It may have been constructed by the Roman Guard around 19 BC under Marcus Agrippa, who was lieutenant to the famed Emperor Augustus. Or it could have been constructed between 40 to 60 BC under Emperor Claudius. No matter who built it and exactly when, it's part of a 31-mile aqueduct that brought water to the city of Nimes. It's part of a system that carried 200,000 cubic meters of water to the city of Nimes. It took 27 hours to get water from the source to the city of Nimes along this aqueduct. So what do we learn about the Roman Empire when we are seeing its construction, when we're looking at this fascinating aqueduct? First, we're seeing that as Rome expanded, as they conquered neighboring territories, as they colonized those neighboring territories, including Nimes, they also expanded their resource offerings to the very same group. They didn't conquer Nimes and then leave them bereft. Had they done that, they may have caused major uprisings. There would have been food shortages, water shortages, all the things that lead to revolution. So the Roman Empire had, I'm sure, learned its lesson prior and began distributing all the things necessary for a content civilization. And this aqueduct, this incredible, incredible infrastructure project, was part of that goal. That sounds super benevolent, right? They're bringing water to the people. They also brought food stores to the people they'd conquered, but it's not as rosy as it seems. Take a second to look at this detail of the aqueduct. What do you see? First, we see a series of brick-like stones, right? Stacked, very regular, same size, same shape. What else do you notice? Do you see that they're built without mortar? If you looked at bricks on the outside of Scales Fine Arts, for example, at Wake, if you looked at any of the buildings on campus, almost without exception, you're going to see a brick and mortar system where you have bricks and then you've got that kind of light grayish mortar in between. We'll learn a bit more about how that mortar functions, but in short, for now, it just makes construction a lot easier. So without the mortar, with this regularity of the stones, we can even see the hatching of the tools carving into the stones as they were being made into regular forms. We know that they were carved to fit perfectly in place. Some of them weighed up to 6 tons each. What does that tell us about the social conditions of Rome? It tells us at least that they were well organized, that there was an ample labor force, that they could take the time to do this very careful construction. And we know from archival material and histories that much of the labor was slave-based. So let's look at some of the exuberant architecture of the empire. Get a piece of paper and a pencil or pen, or use an app on your phone or computer, and draw a triumphal arch. This can be a triumphal arch for anything you feel deserves some triumph. Have fun with it. Do something creative, expressive. Email a picture of it to me when you're done. You can pause the video and work on this further. So let's focus on the Arch of Constantine, one of the most famous arches of Rome. The Emperor Constantine, called Constantine the Great, was significant for several reasons. His support for Christianity, his founding of Constantinople, which is modern-day Istanbul, and his political transformation of the Roman Empire are just a few of the changes that Constantine's reign brought about. He also extended this change into the realm of art and architecture. And the Triumphal Arch of Constantine in Rome is not only an outstanding example of the ideological and stylistic changes that Constantine's reign brought to art, but it also demonstrates the emperor's careful adherence to traditional forms of Roman imperial art and architecture. It's not something you realize when you first look at it. You think, well, this must have been the style of the age. When Constantine built this arch, what he was doing was looking back to the earlier emperors of Rome, trying to embed himself in this historical lineage of Roman Empire. To do that, he took on the look and feel of prior triumphal arches. So you won't be asked to identify a map like this, but I just want you to see the detail and the monumental nature of Rome during Constantine's era. You've now learned how to read plans, so you can see that some of these buildings are fashioned after Greek temples. You can see the dipteral colonnades around, let's say, the Basilica of Ulpia and the Basilica Julia, several different sites. You can see those dotted column markers. And you can begin to envision just how grand, just how majestic, just how impressive the city was built intentionally to be. Part of this grandeur and part of this history was collected on Constantine's arch. Here we're seeing a frieze of Constantine's siege of Maxentius's troops at Verona. You don't need to know this, but that's what we're looking at. We're also seeing the way that older spolia, which means older marble, older friezes, were integrated into Constantine's arch. Basically, he's upcycling artwork that was part of somebody else's arch a long time ago. So beginning in the late 3rd century, the Roman Empire was ruled by 4 co-emperors, 2 seniors and 2 juniors, in an effort to bring political stability after what had been a very turbulent 3rd century. But in 312 CE, Constantine took control over the Western Roman Empire by defeating his co-emperor Maxentius at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge. That's what we're seeing play out here. You can recognize the bridge there on the right. You can see the 2 sets of troops. Constantine's on the left, Maxentius is on the right. There's an inscription below this frieze, which we don't see, which declares Constantine as the rightful ruler of the Western Empire. Curiously, the inscription also attributes rule to a prior emperor, and that's just marking where they forgot to cover over something that had been used before. We see this again and again in these famed Roman architectural features. So, sort of drilling down on that spolia, or those used features, we can see, let's start at the top. Right in the middle, we have a dedicated inscription to Constantine. This is new material. Then, in those blue squares, we have Dacian captives that belonged to former architectural features of Trajan's rule. Below that, we have a series of spandrels. You see that key spandrel right in the center. The voussoir it's pointing out for you are the names of the stones that run down the side from the keystone in the middle. You saw that in that earlier video. We have roundels from Hadrian's era. We have the orange frieze from Constantine, newly made for him. And when you step back and look at that, you can see that only that small part was new. Only that small part was made specifically for Constantine in the celebration of his arch on his own. Now, on the one hand, this is just a tradition. It's what they did. It was a smart reuse of marble. On the other hand, it also tells us a layered story and just one more way that Constantine is building himself into the long history of Rome through these art and architectural features. Another thing this layering does is show us a differentiation in style. Here on the left, we have a roundel showing the sacrifice to Apollo. This was done in Hadrian's era between 117 and 138 CE. On the right, almost 200 years later, we have carving that was done under Constantine. Look at these for a minute. Tell me what you see stylistically. What's happening? If you were going to describe one as realistic or lifelike and the other as more abstract, or you might say more cartoonish, which one are you going to say is which? We have this abstraction on the right. And often we think that abstract art, this early abstract art, happened because they didn't have the skill to do something realistic. But we see on the left, 200 years earlier, they had incredible skill. Those bodies look so real. That drapery, it looks like you could touch it and the clothing would just be soft fabric, right? They've done such incredible realistic work with this stone. What happened? They didn't lose that skill. It's important to note that styles are often a choice. Very few times is it just a matter of not knowing how. And we want to continue to think that way as we look at other cultures that have absolutely erroneously been called primitive because their art styles are more abstract. It's generally a conscious choice to do something in an abstract manner. And often the desire for abstraction is a way of trying to show something otherworldly, trying to show something sacred, holy, non-human. And it's also a way of showing power. We'll get into that more as the class goes. One other thing about this triumphal arch, it was polychrome. That just means multicolored. So you can see here from the image, center screen, how each of those parts of the arch would have been brightly painted. And of course you can see on top there are a group of horses who are no longer there. They were knocked down and or looted over time. But we think about ancient Greece and Rome as like white, pristine marble, so sophisticated, so classical. It's really a very colorful era, and the color has worn away. And we know this because archaeologists are doing studies, art historians, technical art historians are doing studies where they are doing all sorts of scientific work to find out what sort of elements are left behind on this stone. They're doing a lot of work with x-rays, they're doing a lot of work with all sorts of other scanning electron microscopes, figuring out what's there. And we have come to see a real depiction of Constantine's arch here on the left. Okay, moving away from the architecture of victory or lineage, let's take a minute with the Via Appia. This is the road that goes from Rome to Brindisi. Got a great video that tells you all about the way these roads were constructed, exactly what they detailed, just how far they stretched. So now that you're about to close out this video, take a few minutes to go on and see the next one. It will pay off for you on the exam.